The scream that echoed through the Colorado Rockies at 3:47 a.m. would haunt Marcus Chun for the rest of his life. Not because it was terrifying, but because of what came after 20 miles of impossible terrain, a stranger's desperate plea, and a decision that would test every fiber of his being. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What Marcus discovered that night would challenge everything he thought he knew about human endurance, and why sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is exactly what someone asks you not to. The headlights of Marcus Chun's pickup truck cut through the mountain darkness like twin knives, illuminating the winding asphalt of Highway 34 as it snaked through Roosevelt National Forest. It was approaching 4 a.m. on a Tuesday in October, and Marcus was 3 hours into what should have been a peaceful drive back to Denver from his weekend fishing cabin near Grand Lake. The radio crackled with static between stations, and Marcus reached over to adjust the dial when the sound hit him, a piercing scream that seemed to come from somewhere off the road, somewhere in the dense wilderness that stretched endlessly on both sides of the highway. Marcus slammed on the brakes, his truck skidding slightly on the frost-slicked asphalt. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the ticking of his cooling engine and the distant whisper of wind through pine branches. He sat there for a moment, hands gripped tight on the steering wheel, wondering if he'd imagined it. Then it came again, weaker this time, but unmistakably human. A woman's voice, crying out from somewhere in the darkness beyond the tree line. Marcus grabbed his flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out into the mountain cold. The air bit at his lungs, sharp and thin at 8,000 feet elevation. He called out into the darkness, "Hello? Is someone out there?" The response came immediately, desperate and strained. "Here. I'm here. Please help me." Following the voice, Marcus pushed through a gap in the roadside barrier and found himself on a steep slope covered in loose scree and scattered boulders. His flashlight beam swept back and forth as he carefully picked his way down the treacherous terrain, calling out every few steps to maintain contact with the voice. "Keep talking to me," he shouted. "I'm coming to you." "I fell," came the reply, much closer now. "I can't move my leg. Please, I've been here for hours." Marcus's beam finally found her, a young woman, maybe 25 years old, wedged between two large granite boulders about 50 yards from the road. Even from a distance, he could see she was in bad shape. Her hiking clothes were torn and dirty, and her face was pale with shock and pain. As he approached, the full extent of her situation became clear. Her right leg was trapped beneath a fallen log, bent at an angle that made Marcus's stomach turn. Her hiking pack lay scattered nearby, its contents spilled across the rocky ground. "My name is Marcus," he said, kneeling beside her and keeping his voice steady. "What's your name?" "Sarah," she whispered through gritted teeth. "Sarah Williams. I was hiking the Continental Divide Trail, lost the path in the dark, and fell down this slope. That log came down after me." Marcus examined the situation with his flashlight. The log was massive, probably 6 feet long and thick as a telephone pole. Sarah's leg was pinned underneath it, and from what he could see, the bone was likely broken in multiple places. "Sarah, I'm going to get you out of here," he said, "but first, I need to move this log. It's going to hurt when I do." She nodded, tears streaming down her dirt-streaked face. "Just do it." Marcus positioned himself at the end of the log and threw his full weight into lifting it. The dead wood was waterlogged and incredibly heavy, but adrenaline gave him strength he didn't know he had. With a grunt of effort, he managed to roll it just enough for Sarah to pull her mangled leg free. The scream that followed echoed off the surrounding peaks. When she finally stopped, Sarah looked up at Marcus with eyes wide with terror. "I can't feel my foot," she whispered. "I can't feel anything below my knee." Marcus pulled out his cell phone and immediately saw what he'd feared: no signal. They were in a dead zone, surrounded by peaks that blocked any hope of communication with the outside world. "Listen to me, Sarah," he said, crouching down to meet her eyes. "My truck is up on the road. I'm going to carry you up there, and then we'll drive to the nearest hospital." But Sarah was shaking her head frantically. "You can't carry me up that slope. Look at it. Look at how steep it is. You'll fall. You'll drop me." Marcus looked back the way he'd come. In the stark beam of his flashlight, the slope looked even. More treacherous than he remembered: loose rocks, hidden holes, patches of ice where mountain springs had frozen. Sarah was right. Attempting to carry her up that incline in the dark would be suicide for both of them. "Then I'll go get help," he said. "I'll drive to the ranger station, and no." Sarah's voice was urgent, desperate. "Don't leave me here. Please, I've been alone for so long. The cold. I don't think I can survive until you get back." Marcus felt the weight of impossible choices settling on his shoulders. Sarah's condition was serious. He could see she was going into shock, her lips turning blue in the frigid mountain air. But the terrain made rescue nearly impossible, at least until daylight. That's when Sarah grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "There's another way," she said. "The trail. The Continental Divide Trail runs through here. It connects to Forest Service Road 125 about 20 miles south. If you follow the trail markers, you can carry me out that way." Marcus stared at her. 20 miles, Sarah, that's... "It's mostly downhill," she said quickly. "And the trail is designed for hiking. It'll be safer than trying to go straight up this cliff." Marcus played his flashlight beam around the area until he found what Sarah was pointing to, a small wooden post with the familiar diamond-shaped trail marker, barely visible through the trees. 20 miles, through wilderness, carrying an injured person in the dark. "Sarah, I don't know if I can." "Leave me here," she said suddenly, her voice breaking. "Just leave me here and go get help. I was wrong to ask you to carry me. It's too far, too dangerous." But even as she said the words, Marcus could see the fear in her eyes. Fear of being alone in the dark. Fear of dying before help could arrive. Fear of the cold that was already sapping her strength. Marcus Chun had spent 34 years living a careful, measured life. He was an accountant from Denver who enjoyed weekend fishing trips and quiet evenings at home. He'd never considered himself particularly brave or strong. But looking at Sarah Williams, trapped and broken in the Colorado wilderness, he felt something shift inside him. "I'm not leaving you," he said firmly. "We're going to try the trail." Sarah's eyes widened. "Marcus, no, I was delirious. 20 miles carrying someone... It's impossible. You could die trying." "Maybe," Marcus said, already moving to gather her scattered belongings. "But you'll definitely die if I leave you here." He found Sarah's water bottles and energy bars, stuffing what he could into his jacket pockets. Her sleeping bag was torn but still usable as padding. Most importantly, he found her GPS unit still functional, with the trail route clearly marked. "I need to stabilize your leg before we move," Marcus said, looking around for materials. He found several straight branches and used strips torn from Sarah's backpack to create a crude splint. Sarah bit down on her jacket sleeve to keep from screaming as he worked. When he was finished, Marcus knelt down and carefully positioned Sarah on his back, her arms around his neck, her injured leg supported by the makeshift stretcher he'd created using her sleeping bag and hiking poles. The additional weight was immediately overwhelming. Sarah probably weighed around 120 pounds, but with her gear and his own supplies, Marcus was carrying nearly 150 pounds. Each step sent shooting pains through his legs and back. "This is insane," Sarah whispered in his ear. "Put me down, please. Just leave me and go for help." But Marcus had already started walking toward the trail marker, his legs shaking with the effort. Behind them, The lights of his truck grew smaller and smaller until they disappeared entirely, swallowed by the vast darkness of the forest. The Continental Divide Trail stretched ahead of them like a ribbon through the wilderness, marked by occasional, reflective blazes that caught Marcus's flashlight beam. According to Sarah's GPS, it was 19.7 miles to the Forest Service Road, where they could hope to flag down help. The first mile was the hardest. Marcus's body screamed in protest at the unnatural load, and twice he had to stop to rest, setting Sarah down gently against tree trunks while he caught his breath. Each time, she begged him to leave her and go for help alone. "I can't feel my leg anyway," she kept saying. "The cold is making everything numb. Just go, please." But Marcus had made his choice. With each step, he felt himself moving further from the safe, predictable world he'd always known and deeper into something that would test limits he'd never imagined he possessed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The trail wound through stands of aspen and pine, occasionally opening onto rocky meadows, where the moonlight provided brief respite from the oppressive darkness of the forest. Marcus developed a rhythm: 20 steps, then rested for 30 seconds, 20 more steps, another rest. He counted each sequence, using the numbers to distract himself from the fire burning in his shoulders and the growing certainty that he'd made a terrible mistake. By the time they'd covered 3 miles, Sarah had stopped talking entirely. Her head lolled against Marcus's shoulder, and her breathing had become shallow and irregular. Hypothermia was setting in, and Marcus realized that speed was now more important than caution. He pushed harder, extending his sequences to 30 steps, then 40, ignoring the voice in his head that screamed for him to stop. The trail began to descend more steeply, following the contours of a deep valley. In the distance, Marcus could hear the sound of running water, a mountain stream that the trail would eventually follow toward lower elevations. It was during the 5th mile that Marcus began to understand what he was really attempting. This wasn't just about physical endurance or determination. This was about something deeper, about the choice to take responsibility for another human being's life, regardless of the cost to himself. Sarah stirred occasionally, mumbling incoherently about the cold, about her family back in Ohio, about how sorry she was for putting him through this ordeal. Each time, Marcus whispered reassurances he wasn't sure he believed. "We're going to make it," he would say. "Just a few more miles." But inside, doubt gnawed at him like hunger. His body was already showing signs of exhaustion, and they weren't even halfway to their destination. His legs trembled with each step, and his vision had begun to blur around the edges from the strain of carrying so much weight for so long. The trail took them through a section of deadfall trees knocked down by some long-ago storm, their massive trunks creating an obstacle course that forced Marcus to climb over, under, and around barriers while maintaining his grip on Sarah. More than once, he slipped on icy logs, Sarah's weight nearly sending them both tumbling into the darkness below. During one particularly treacherous passage, Sarah regained consciousness long enough to realize where they were. "How far?" she whispered. Marcus checked the GPS with numb fingers. "About 12 miles left." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I'm going to die, aren't I?" The question hung in the cold air between them. Marcus could feel Sarah's body shivering against his back, could sense her growing weakness. He'd never been in a situation like this, had no medical training, no wilderness experience beyond weekend fishing trips. But he kept walking. "No," he said finally. "You're not going to die. Neither of us is." As they descended further into the valley, the trail became easier to follow but more dangerous in other ways. The sound of rushing water grew louder, and Marcus realized they would eventually have to cross the stream. In October, mountain water would be near freezing, and any mishap could be fatal for both of them. The crossing came at mile 8. Trail led directly to a wooden footbridge that spanned a creek swollen with snowmelt from the peaks above. In daylight, it would have been a simple crossing. In the dark, with an injured person on his back and legs that could barely support his own weight, it looked like a death trap. The bridge was maybe 20 feet long, with handrails on both sides. But the wood was slick with frost, and the structure swayed ominously in the mountain wind. Below, Marcus could see white water rushing over rocks, the sound almost deafening in the still night air. "I can't do this," Marcus said aloud, the first time he'd admitted doubt. Sarah lifted her head slightly. "What is it?" "There's a bridge. It's icy if I fall." "Then put me down," Sarah said immediately. "Cross alone, then come back for me." But Marcus knew that wasn't an option. Sarah's condition had deteriorated steadily over the past few hours. Her periods of consciousness were becoming shorter and less coherent. If he left her here while he crossed the bridge, she might not be alive when he returned. Marcus approached the bridge slowly, testing each board with his foot before committing his full weight. The structure groaned under their combined load, and ice made every step treacherous. Halfway across, a gust of wind set the entire bridge swaying, and Marcus had to grip the handrail so tightly that his knuckles went white, one step at a time, one board at a time. The roar of water below seemed to grow louder, as if the creek was calling to them, waiting for them to fall. When Marcus finally stepped off the bridge onto solid ground on the far side, his legs gave out entirely. He collapsed to his knees, Sarah still strapped to his back, both of them breathing heavily in the thin mountain air. They had covered 8 miles. Less than halfway to safety. And the hardest part of the journey still lay ahead. The collapse beside the creek bridge changed everything. As Marcus knelt there, gasping in the frigid mountain air with Sarah's unconscious weight on his back, he felt the first real wave of despair wash over him. His body was shutting down, muscles cramping, vision blurring from exhaustion, hands so numb he could barely grip Sarah's arms around his neck. But it was Sarah's stillness that terrified him most. She hadn't spoken in over an hour, and her breathing had become so shallow he had to strain to feel it against his shoulder. When he managed to check her pulse at her wrist, it was rapid and thready, classic signs of severe shock. Marcus forced himself to stand, his knees nearly buckling under the weight. The GPS showed they had covered 8 miles, but the remaining distance to Forest Service Road 125 stretched before them like an impossible mountain range of numbers. 11. 7 miles still to go. The trail beyond the bridge entered what Sarah's map labeled as Wilderness Study Area, a section of protected land where no motorized vehicles were permitted, where the only trails were those carved by decades of hikers' boots and wildlife movement. Here, the path became less distinct, marked only by occasional cairns, small stacks of rocks left by previous travelers. Marcus had never felt so alone in his life. The forest pressed in around them, a living wall of darkness punctuated only by the weak beam of his flashlight. Every shadow could hide a cliff edge, every sound might signal danger. And with each step, Sarah's weight seemed to increase, as if gravity itself was conspiring against them. 3 miles past the bridge, the trail split. Marcus stood at the junction, playing his flashlight beam over 2 equally worn paths diverging into the wilderness. Sarah's GPS showed the route, but the screen was cracked from their earlier fall, and condensation had fogged the display. The left path appeared to descend gradually toward what looked like a valley. The right path climbed steeply up a ridge before disappearing into dense timber. According to the fractured GPS reading, the correct route was the left path, but Marcus couldn't be certain. A wrong turn here could add miles to their journey, miles that neither of them could afford. Sarah stirred slightly as Marcus hesitated at the crossroads. "Which way?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Marcus made the decision that would haunt him for the next 2 hours. He chose the left path, the one that seemed easier, the one that promised gentler terrain ahead. For the first mile, his choice seemed vindicated. The trail descended gradually through a meadow dotted with alpine wildflowers, their petals closed against the night cold. The walking was easier here, and Marcus managed to increase his pace slightly, driven by the hope that maybe, just maybe, they were going to survive this ordeal. But then the meadow ended, and the trail plunged into a nightmare. What had looked like a gentle valley from above revealed itself to be a steep-sided canyon carved by eons of snowmelt and flash floods. The path switched back down the canyon wall, a narrow ledge barely wide enough for a single hiker, with a sheer drop-off on one side and unstable scree on the other. Marcus realized his mistake immediately, but turning back would cost them precious time and energy they didn't have. Sarah's condition was deteriorating rapidly, her skin was cold and clammy, and she had begun to shiver uncontrollably, her body's desperate attempt to generate heat. The descent into the canyon was a controlled fall. Marcus's legs shook with each step, and several times loose rocks gave way beneath his feet, sending him sliding down the trail with Sarah's weight threatening to pull them both over the edge. His flashlight illuminated only a few feet ahead, turning each step into an act of faith. Halfway down the canyon wall, disaster struck. A section of trail that had looked solid crumbled under their combined weight. Marcus felt the ground give way beneath his right foot, and suddenly he was falling sideways toward the canyon's edge. Instinctively, he threw himself backward, slamming both himself and Sarah into the rocky slope behind them. Sarah's scream pierced the night, the first sound she'd made in hours. The impact had jarred her broken leg, sending shockwaves of agony through her body. But they were alive, pressed against the canyon wall instead of tumbling into the darkness below. Marcus lay there for several minutes, feeling warm wetness spreading across his back. When he reached around to investigate, his hand came away dark with blood. Sarah's makeshift splint had shifted during the fall, and a jagged piece of wood had torn through her pant leg and into the flesh of her thigh. "I'm bleeding," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with pain and exhaustion. Marcus managed to twist around enough to examine the wound with his flashlight. It wasn't life-threatening, but it was adding to her blood loss and shock. Using strips torn from his own shirt, he created a pressure bandage, working by feel in the confined space between Sarah's body and the rock wall. "Marcus," Sarah said. As he worked, "I need to tell you something." "Save your strength," Marcus replied, but Sarah continued anyway. "I lied about the trail, back when we started. I told you it was mostly downhill, that it would be easier." Her words came in short bursts between labored breaths. "I knew it wasn't true. I was desperate. I didn't want to die alone." Marcus paused. "In his bandaging, what do you mean?" "The Continental Divide Trail through this section. It's rated as one of the most difficult stretches in Colorado. Experienced hikers take 3 days to cover this distance. What we're trying to do... it's impossible." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. For the past 4 hours, he had sustained himself on the belief that this rescue was difficult, but achievable. Now Sarah was telling him that he had committed himself to an impossible task based on her lie born of desperation. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked. "Because we're going to die out here," Sarah said simply. "Both of us, and I can't have your death on my conscience. Put me down, Marcus. Leave me and save yourself. You still have time." Marcus looked out into the canyon, where his flashlight beam disappeared into seemingly infinite darkness. Below them, he could hear water rushing over rocks, another creek that would need to be crossed, another obstacle in an endless series of challenges. For a moment, he genuinely considered Sarah's suggestion. Every rational part of his mind screamed that she was right. This was suicide, an impossible task that would result in 2 deaths instead of 1. He could leave her here, hike back to the road, and return with professional rescuers who had the equipment and training for this kind of operation. But then, Sarah started to cry, not from pain, but from something deeper. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, a broken sob that spoke of abandonment and terror and the awful certainty of dying alone in the dark. Marcus finished the pressure bandage and carefully repositioned Sarah on his back. "We're not dying out here," he said firmly. "Neither of us." "Marcus, please. We're not dying," he repeated, and resumed his descent into the canyon. The bottom of the canyon was a different world entirely. Here, massive boulders the size of houses had tumbled from the walls above, creating a maze of stone passages and hidden pools. The creek that Marcus had heard from above wound between the rocks, sometimes visible, sometimes disappearing underground, only to emerge again dozens of yards away. Finding the trail in this chaos proved nearly impossible. Marcus spent 20 precious minutes searching for trail markers, following what looked like paths only to have them end at impassable rock walls. His flashlight began to dim the batteries, failing after hours of constant use, and panic started to creep into his movements. It was Sarah, in a brief moment of consciousness, who spotted the way forward. "There," she whispered, pointing weakly toward what looked like just another gap between boulders. "The blazes on that rock." Marcus aimed his fading flashlight beam where Sarah indicated and saw it, a faint white diamond painted on the dark stone. Barely visible but unmistakably a trail marker. The path through the boulder field was a three-dimensional puzzle that tested every remaining ounce of Marcus's strength and balance. He had to climb over some rocks, crawl under others, and navigate narrow passages where the walls pressed in from both sides. Several times he had to remove his jacket and push it ahead of them to create enough space for Sarah's body to fit. Through the gaps, each obstacle was a separate ordeal. Each successful passage felt like a small miracle. And through it all, Sarah's weight pressed down on his shoulders like a constant reminder of how close they both were to complete collapse. Creek crossing at the canyon bottom nearly ended their journey permanently. The water was deeper than Marcus had expected, waist-deep and moving fast, with a bottom of loose stones that shifted treacherously underfoot. There was no bridge here, no handrails or support of any kind. Marcus waded into the current immediately, feeling the shocking cold of snow-melt water penetrate his boots and soak through his pants. Each step was a battle against the current, trying to sweep them downstream toward hidden rocks and deeper pools. Halfway across, Marcus's foot slipped on a moss-covered stone. He went down on one knee, Sarah's weight driving him deeper into the rushing water. For a terrifying moment, they were both submerged up to their necks in the icy creek, the current threatening to tear them apart and carry them away. Marcus found his footing just as Sarah began to panic, her arms tightening around his throat in a death grip that nearly strangled him. He fought his way to the far bank and collapsed on the rocky shore, both of them soaked and shivering violently. Clothes made everything worse. In the October mountain air, hypothermia became an immediate threat for both of them. Marcus's flashlight had been submerged and now provided only a weak flickering glow that barely illuminated their immediate surroundings. "We have to keep moving," Marcus said through chattering teeth, but when he tried to stand, his legs wouldn't support him. The combination of exhaustion, cold, and the shock of the river crossing had pushed his body beyond its limits. For 5 minutes, they lay beside the creek, shivering in the darkness. Marcus felt consciousness beginning to slip away, felt the dangerous warmth of hypothermia starting to cloud his thinking. This was how people died in the wilderness, not from dramatic falls or animal attacks, but from the gradual shutdown of vital systems, from cold and exhaustion, and the body's simple inability to continue functioning. It was the sound of Sarah's labored breathing that pulled him back from the edge. Her respirations had become irregular, sometimes stopping entirely, for long seconds before resuming with a gasping intake of air. She was dying, and every minute they spent lying beside this creek brought her closer to a death that would also claim him. Marcus forced himself to stand, water streaming from his soaked clothes, and carefully lifted Sarah back onto his shoulders. The additional weight of their wet clothing made the load almost unbearable, but he began to walk anyway, following the faint trail markers deeper into the wilderness. The next 3 miles tested the absolute limits of human endurance. Marcus's world contracted to the simple mechanics of putting one foot in front of the other, of maintaining his grip on Sarah's unconscious form, of following the weak beam of his dying flashlight from one trail blaze to the next. He lost track of time entirely. Minutes could have been hours, hours could have been minutes. Reality became a dreamlike sequence of obstacles overcome through pure stubborn refusal to quit. A fallen tree that required climbing over with Sarah's dead weight. On his back, a section of trail washed out by some long-ago flood, forcing a detour through thick undergrowth that left them both bleeding from dozens of cuts and scrapes. When Marcus's flashlight finally died completely, plunging them into absolute darkness, he nearly gave up. Standing in the middle of the wilderness with no light, no clear sense of direction, and a dying woman on his back, the hopelessness of their situation seemed overwhelming. But then the moon emerged from behind a cloud bank, casting enough light to reveal the landscape around them. Marcus realized they had climbed out of the canyon and were now on a broad ridge covered with scattered pine trees. And there, barely visible in the pale moonlight, was something that made his heart leap with desperate hope. Power lines. 2 thin cables stretched between tall poles, cutting a straight line through the forest. Power lines meant civilization, meant roads, meant the possibility of rescue. Marcus began following the power line corridor, stumbling over the uneven ground, but driven forward by the first real hope he had felt in hours. Sarah remained unconscious, but her breathing seemed slightly more regular, as if some part of her sensed that salvation might be within reach. The power lines led them down the far side of the ridge toward a valley where Marcus could see a few scattered lights twinkling in the distance. Buildings, houses, people who could help them survive this nightmare that had begun so many hours and so many miles ago. But they still had miles to go, and Marcus wasn't sure his body had any more to give. The power lines became Marcus's lifeline in more ways than one. Following their steady march across the mountainous terrain, he could measure progress not in the uncertain distances of wilderness trails, but in the reassuring geometry of utility poles stretching towards civilization. Each towering structure marked another small victory, another step closer to the impossible goal that had seemed so hopeless just hours before. But the power line corridor brought its own unique challenges. The utility company had cleared a wide swath through the forest, creating an open pathway that offered no protection from the fierce mountain winds that swept down from the peaks above. Without the shelter of trees, the October cold became a living thing that clawed at Marcus's exposed skin and penetrated his still damp clothing with ruthless efficiency. Sarah's condition had stabilized. Somewhat her breathing was more regular, and she occasionally mumbled incoherent words that at least proved she was still alive. But the combination of blood loss, hypothermia, and shock was taking its toll. Marcus could feel her body temperature dropping against his back, could sense her life force ebbing away with each labored breath. The power line trail led them along the spine of a ridge that offered spectacular views in daylight, but now presented only an endless expanse of silver-touched darkness under the pale moon. Marcus found himself moving like a sleepwalker, his body operating on autopilot while his conscious mind retreated into a strange detached state where pain and exhaustion became abstract concepts rather than immediate realities. It was during this dreamlike phase of the journey that Marcus began to hallucinate. At first, he thought he saw other hikers on the trail, ahead of him, shadowy figures that vanished when he tried to focus on them. Then he started hearing voices calling his name from the darkness beyond the power lines, voices that sounded like his father, his ex-wife, friends from work who couldn't possibly be out here in the wilderness. The hallucinations were a symptom of severe exhaustion and dehydration. Marcus realized during his more lucid moments. His body was beginning to shut down non-essential functions, and his brain was creating phantom stimuli to fill in the gaps. But knowing the cause didn't make the visions any less disturbing, especially when they began to include Sarah walking beside him, chatting casually about her life as if she weren't unconscious and dying on his back. The fourth power line tower revealed something that stopped Marcus in his tracks. Attached to one of the metal support beams was a small metal box with a padlock and warning signs, an emergency telephone for utility workers. Marcus approached it with trembling hands, hoping against hope that the phone might work, that he might be able to call for help. The box was locked, but the metal was old and weathered. Using a rock from the ground, Marcus managed to break the padlock after several minutes of desperate hammering. Inside was indeed a telephone, an ancient rotary model connected directly to the utility company's emergency line. Marcus lifted the heavy receiver to his ear and heard ... nothing. No dial tone, no connection of any kind. The phone was dead, probably for years. Another dead end, another false hope in a night that had been filled with them. But beside the useless telephone, Marcus found something that proved far more valuable, a laminated map showing the power line route and the surrounding road network. According to the map, they were much closer to Forest Service Road 125 than Sarah's damaged GPS had indicated. Maybe only 5 or 6 miles remained, not the 11 that Marcus had been dreading. The map also showed something else, a maintenance access road that intersected the power line corridor just 2 miles ahead. If that road was still passable, if it connected to the larger road network, it could cut their remaining journey in half. Energized by this discovery, Marcus pressed forward with renewed determination. The maintenance road, when he found it, turned out to be little more than 2 parallel ruts carved into the mountainside by utility trucks. But it was definitely a road, the first sign of motorized civilization they had encountered since leaving. Marcus's truck behind on Highway 34, the access road descended steeply through a series of switchbacks, carved into the slope with the brutal efficiency that only heavy machinery could achieve. Walking was easier here, despite the grade, because the road surface was graded and relatively smooth. For the first time in hours, Marcus didn't have to worry about loose rocks or hidden obstacles, but the steep descent created a new problem. With each downward step, Sarah's weight seemed to pull him forward, threatening to send them both tumbling down the mountainside in an uncontrolled fall. Marcus had to lean backward against her weight, fighting gravity with muscles that had long since passed the point of exhaustion. 3 switchbacks down the access road, Marcus's left knee gave out entirely. The joint, stressed beyond its limits by hours of carrying an impossible load over treacherous terrain, simply stopped functioning. Marcus felt it buckle and collapse, sending him crashing to the rocky road surface with Sarah still strapped to his back. The fall scraped skin from his palms and knees, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the crushing realization that his body was finally betraying him. Marcus tried to stand and immediately collapsed again, as his damaged knee refused to bear weight. For several minutes, he sat in the middle of the mountain road, Sarah's unconscious form still on his back, and contemplated the awful mathematics of their situation. They had come so far, survived so much, only to be stopped by the simple mechanical failure of a joint that had been asked to do too much for too long. But giving up wasn't an option. Not when they were this close. Not when Sarah's life hung in the balance. Marcus fashioned a crude brace for his knee using his belt and a straight piece of wood from the roadside. The improvised support was painful and awkward, but it allowed him to bear weight on the damaged joint. He resumed his descent, moving now with an awkward, limping gait that made each step a separate ordeal. The access road seemed to go on forever, winding back and forth across the mountainside in a pattern that added distance but made the descent manageable for vehicles. Marcus counted switchbacks like a rosary: 7, 8, 9 each turn, bringing them lower into the valley where the lights he had seen earlier burned like beacons of hope. On the 10th switchback, Marcus heard the most beautiful sound of his life, the distant hum of traffic on a paved road. Forest Service Road 125 lay just ahead, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the valley floor. Marcus could see occasional headlights moving along it late night, travelers who represented the first potential rescue they had encountered since this ordeal began. But reaching the road required one final descent down a steep embankment covered with loose scree and scattered boulders. In his current condition, with his damaged knee and Sarah's weight on his back, the descent looked nearly impossible. Marcus sat at the top of the embankment and tried to calculate the risks. If he fell during the descent, they could both be seriously injured or killed. But if he didn't attempt it, they would be stranded just yards away from potential rescue, close enough to see salvation but unable to reach it. The decision was made. For him, when Sarah stirred to consciousness for the first time in hours, "Marcus?" Her voice was weak but coherent. "Where are we?" "We made it," Marcus said, pointing down at the road below. "That's Forest Service Road 125. We just need to get down there and flag down a car." Sarah lifted her head slightly and saw the lights moving along the distant asphalt. For a moment, neither of them spoke, both overwhelmed by the realization that they had actually survived the impossible journey through the wilderness. "How long have we been walking?" Sarah asked. Marcus checked his watch, surprised to find it was nearly 9 a.m. They had been traveling for over 12 hours, covering 20 miles of some of the most difficult terrain in Colorado. What had seemed like an impossible task in the darkness beside Highway 34 had somehow been accomplished through sheer stubborn refusal to quit. "Can you hold on a little longer?" Marcus asked. "This last part is going to be rough." Sarah's arms tightened around his neck. "I'm not letting go." Now, the descent to the road was controlled chaos. Marcus half walked, half slid down the loose slope, using his good leg for balance and his damaged knee for steering. Rocks scattered around them with each step, creating small avalanches that threatened to carry them, both tumbling into the drainage ditch beside the road. Halfway down, Marcus lost his footing entirely. They slid the final 20 feet in a cascade of loose stone and dust, coming to rest in a heap beside the asphalt surface of Forest Service Road 125. Marcus lay there for a moment, hardly believing they had made it. The road was real solid pavement beneath his hands, painted lines marking traffic lanes, reflective markers along the shoulder. After 20 miles of wilderness trail, it seemed like a miracle of civilization. But the road was also empty. No traffic in either direction, no sign of the vehicles whose lights they had seen from above. Marcus realized they might have to wait hours for another car to pass, and in their current condition, hours could be too long. Using the last reserves of his strength, Marcus pulled Sarah to a sitting position against the guardrail and positioned himself in the middle of the road. If a car did come, he would make sure it couldn't miss them. They waited in the growing daylight, two broken figures beside a mountain road, survivors of an ordeal that had tested every limit of human endurance. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, but her breathing remained steady. Marcus's knee throbbed with each heartbeat, and his entire body felt like it had been disassembled and poorly reassembled. The sun was fully above the eastern peaks when they heard the rumble of a diesel engine echoing off the valley walls. A Colorado Department of Transportation truck appeared around a curve, moving slowly as its driver checked road conditions after the night's frost. Marcus waved his arms frantically, standing in the middle of the road despite the agony in his knee. The truck slowed, stopped, and the driver, a weathered man in his 50s wearing a DOT uniform, jumped out and ran toward them. "Jesus Christ," the driver said, taking in their condition. "What happened to you folks?" "She fell," Marcus said simply, the first words he had spoken to another human being in over 12 hours. "I carried her from the Continental Divide Trail." The driver, whose name tag read Bill Martinez, immediately called for an ambulance. On his radio, while examining Sarah's injuries. Within minutes, the quiet mountain road was filled with the sound of sirens as emergency vehicles converged on their location, as the paramedics took over Sarah's care, loading her onto a stretcher. And starting 4 fluids, one of them turned to Marcus. "Sir, how far did you carry her?" Marcus looked back up the mountainside, toward the power lines that had guided them to safety, toward the wilderness that had tested every fiber of his being. 20 miles, he said quietly. The paramedic stared at him in disbelief. 20 miles? Through this terrain, in one night? Marcus nodded, suddenly feeling the full weight of exhaustion settling over him like a heavy blanket. His legs buckled, and he found himself sitting on the road's shoulder, watching as Sarah was loaded into the ambulance. As the emergency vehicles prepared to leave, Sarah managed to grab Marcus's hand through the ambulance's open door. "Why?" she whispered. "Why didn't you leave me?" Marcus looked at this woman, whose name he had learned only hours ago, whose desperate situation had transformed him from a careful accountant into someone capable of impossible things. "Because," he said simply, "that's not who I wanted to be." The Yingdi ambulance pulled away, carrying Sarah toward the hospital in Denver, where surgeons would spend the next 6 hours rebuilding her shattered leg. Marcus was taken in a separate vehicle, his own injuries requiring attention, the damaged knee, severe dehydration, exhaustion, and dozens of cuts and bruises accumulated during their marathon journey. As they drove away from Forest Service Road 125, Marcus watched the wilderness recede behind them. Somewhere back there, his truck still sat beside Highway 34, waiting for him to return. Somewhere back there, a trail stretched through 20 miles of Colorado wilderness, marked now by their footsteps and their survival. The impossible had become possible through the simple refusal to accept defeat. And in carrying Sarah Williams to safety, Marcus Chen had discovered reserves of strength and determination he never knew he possessed. The sterile brightness of Denver General Hospital's emergency room felt like an alien landscape after 20 miles of wilderness darkness. Marcus sat on the edge of an examination table, his damaged knee wrapped in ice packs, watching through the window as morning traffic began to build on the distant highways. The normal world, the world of commuters and coffee, shops and predictable routines, seemed impossibly foreign after what he had experienced in the mountains. Dr. Jennifer Walsh finished reviewing his x-rays with the practiced efficiency of someone who had seen every conceivable injury during her 15 years in emergency medicine. But Marcus could tell that his case was unusual by the way she kept glancing at his chart, then back at him, as if trying to reconcile the mild-mannered man sitting before her with the extraordinary feat described in the paramedics' report. "Mr. Chen," she said finally, "I've been doing this for a long time, and I have to ask, are you sure about the distance? 20 miles? Carrying another person?" Marcus nodded wearily. The question had been asked a dozen times since his arrival at the hospital, by paramedics, nurses, admission staff, and now the doctor. Each time, he gave the same simple answer, but he could see the disbelief in their eyes. 20 miles was the distance of a marathon, a distance that challenged trained athletes running on flat surfaces with optimal gear and conditions. The Continental Divide Trail through that section is extremely difficult terrain, Dr. Walsh continued. What you've described, frankly, it shouldn't be physiologically possible. But the evidence was written across Marcus's body. His shoulders bore deep indentations from Sarah's weight, red welts that would take weeks to heal. His hands were torn and bleeding from countless falls and grabs for support. His legs showed the accumulated damage of a 12-hour ordeal that had pushed human endurance beyond its normal limits. "How is she?" Marcus asked, deflecting attention from his own condition. "Sarah Williams, the woman I brought in." Dr. Walsh's expression grew more serious. "She's in surgery. Dr. Rodriguez is our best orthopedic surgeon. But double quote, she paused, choosing her words carefully. Her injuries are extensive. Compound fractures, severe soft tissue damage, potential nerve involvement. She lost a significant amount of blood during the night. The unspoken question hung in the air between them. Had Marcus's desperate rescue mission been worth it? Would Sarah survive with her leg intact, or had their ordeal merely postponed the inevitable? "Doctor," Marcus said quietly, "if I had left her where she fell and gone for help instead, would she have survived until a rescue team could reach her?" Dr. Walsh met his eyes directly. "In her condition, in those temperatures? Honestly, I don't think she would have lasted 2 hours." The confirmation hit Marcus harder than he had expected. Throughout the long night, he had tortured himself with second-guessing, wondering if his decision to attempt the impossible rescue had been an act of heroism or dangerous stupidity. Now he knew there had been no other choice. Sarah would have died without his intervention. After Dr. Walsh finished her examination and prescribed rest, physical therapy, and a follow-up appointment for his knee, Marcus found himself in the hospital's waiting room, surrounded by the quiet drama of families dealing with their own medical emergencies. He had called his office to explain his absence, a conversation that required considerable creativity to explain why he wouldn't be coming to work for several days. Food poisoning, he had told his supervisor Linda Patterson, unwilling to explain the real reason for his condition. The truth was too extraordinary, too far outside the normal parameters of his careful, predictable life. It was nearly noon when Dr. Rodriguez emerged from the surgical suite, still wearing scrubs and the exhausted expression of someone who had spent 6 hours performing microscopic miracles. Marcus recognized him immediately, a compact, intense man in his 40s whose reputation as a surgeon was legendary throughout Colorado's medical community. "Are you Marcus Chun?" Dr. Rodriguez asked, approaching the waiting area. Marcus stood, his damaged knee protesting the movement. "Yes, how is she?" "Alive," Dr. Rodriguez said simply. Which, given her condition when she arrived, is something of a miracle in itself. He gestured toward a pair of chairs, and they sat down together. "I've been able to repair most of the damage. 3 pins in the tibia, reconstruction of the ligaments, extensive soft tissue repair. She walk again, though she probably always have some limitations." The relief that washed over Marcus was overwhelming. After everything they had endured, after 20 miles of wondering if he was carrying a corpse through the wilderness, Sarah was going to survive. "There's something else," Dr. Rodriguez continued. "Something I need you to understand about what you did last night." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to the intense tone doctors reserve for delivering crucial information. "Miss Williams was suffering from severe hypothermia when she arrived. Her core body temperature was dangerously low. But here's the remarkable thing: your body heat during those 12 hours of carrying her probably saved her life. Without that constant warmth, she would have died from exposure long before you reached the road." Marcus stared at the surgeon, processing this information. He had saved Sarah's life not just by carrying her to safety, but by the simple act of sharing his body heat during the coldest part of the night. "I've been practicing medicine for 20 years, Dr. Rodriguez said, "and I've never seen anything quite like this. What you did, it defies every conventional understanding of human physical limitations." Over the following days, as Marcus recovered in his Denver apartment, the story began to take on a life of its own. Bill Martinez, the DOT worker who had found them on Forest Service Road 125, had filed a report that made its way through state agencies and eventually to local news outlets. By Thursday, 3 days after the rescue, Marcus's phone was ringing constantly with requests for interviews. The first reporter to track him down was Janet Morrison from the Denver Post, a veteran journalist who specialized in human interest stories. She arrived at his apartment with a photographer and a list of questions that made Marcus deeply uncomfortable. "Mr. Chun, our readers want to know what drove you to attempt such an extraordinary rescue," she said, her digital recorder capturing every word. "What made you think you could carry another person 20 miles through wilderness terrain?" Marcus sat in his living room, his injured knee elevated on a coffee table, trying to find words for something that still felt surreal even to him. "I didn't think about whether I could do it," he said finally. "I just knew I couldn't leave her there to die." "But you're an accountant," Morrison pressed. "You have no special training in wilderness rescue, no background in extreme athletics. What made you believe this was possible?" The question touched on something that Marcus had been struggling to understand himself. During the rescue, he had discovered capabilities he never knew he possessed, not just physical strength, but mental resilience and determination that seemed to come from some deep reservoir he had never accessed before. "Maybe I didn't believe it was possible," he admitted. "Maybe I just refused to accept that it was impossible." The story ran on the front page of the Sunday Denver Post under the headline, "Accountant's 20-mile miracle. Denver man carries injured hiker to safety." The article included a detailed map of their route, interviews with the medical team that had treated Sarah, and expert analysis from wilderness rescue professionals who confirmed the extraordinary nature of Marcus's achievement within hours of the newspaper's publication. Marcus's story had been picked up by national news outlets. CNN ran a segment during their morning show. Good Morning America requested an interview. Social media exploded with shares and comments, turning Marcus Chun from an anonymous accountant into an overnight symbol of human determination and compassion. But the attention made Marcus profoundly uncomfortable. He had never sought recognition. For his actions had never considered himself heroic. The constant phone calls and interview requests felt invasive, turning a deeply personal experience into public entertainment. It was Sarah who provided perspective when she called him from her hospital bed on the following Tuesday. "Marcus, I've been watching the news coverage," she said, her voice still weak but gaining strength daily. "I wanted to thank you, but also to apologize." "Apologize for what?" "For putting you through all this media circus. For lying to you about the trail. For asking you to do something that could have killed you." Sarah paused, and Marcus could hear the emotion in her voice. "I've had a lot of time to think while lying here, and I realize how selfish I was. I was so terrified of dying alone that I manipulated you into risking your own life." Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering her words. During his own recovery time, he had reflected extensively on the events of that night, trying to understand his own motivations and the chain of decisions that had led them both to survival. "Sarah," he said finally, "I made my own choices that night. Every step of the way, I could have turned back. I could have left you and gone for help. But I didn't, and that was my decision, not yours." "But why?" Sarah asked, echoing her question from the ambulance. "Why didn't you leave me?" "Any rational person would have realized that attempting to carry me 20 miles was suicide." It was a question that Marcus had been asked dozens of times by reporters, family members, and friends. Everyone wanted to understand the psychology behind his decision, wanted to find some explanation for behavior that seemed to defy logic and self-preservation. "Because," Marcus said, "I realized that night that there are things more important than being rational. There are moments when you have to choose between the person you've always been and the person you want to become." The conversation with Sarah marked a turning point for Marcus. He stopped accepting interview requests, declined appearances on talk shows, and gradually withdrew from the media attention that had transformed his life into a public spectacle. The story eventually faded from the news cycle, replaced by other human interest stories and daily dramas. But the experience had changed Marcus in ways that went far beyond the physical scars and damaged knee. He found himself unable to return to the comfortable routine of his previous life. The work that had once seemed important, tax calculations and financial statements, now felt trivial compared to the life and death decisions he had faced in the wilderness. 3 months after the rescue, Marcus submitted his resignation to the accounting firm where he had worked for 8 years. His supervisor, Linda Patterson, was bewildered by his decision. "Marcus, you're one of our most reliable employees," she protested. "Where are you going? What are you planning to do?" Marcus looked out the window of her office toward the Front Range mountains visible in the distance, peaks that no longer seemed like distant landscape features, but like familiar territory he had personally traversed. "I'm going to train as a wilderness rescue volunteer," he said. "There are other people out there who might need help someday." The decision felt right in a way that surprised him. For 34 years, Marcus had lived a life of careful calculation and risk avoidance. But his experience with Sarah had shown him that the most meaningful moments often came from abandoning safety and embracing the impossible. 6 months later, Marcus completed his certification with Colorado Search and Rescue. On his first official mission searching for a lost hiker in the same wilderness area where he had carried Sarah, he found himself thinking about that night, when everything had changed. He had entered those mountains as an accountant named Marcus Chun. He had emerged as someone entirely different, someone capable of extraordinary things when the situation demanded them. The transformation hadn't happened gradually over years of training and preparation. It had occurred in a single night, across 20 miles of impossible terrain, with a stranger's life depending on his refusal to accept defeat. As Marcus hiked through the familiar landscape with his rescue team, following GPS coordinates and radio chatter toward another person in need of help, he understood that some journeys change you not because of where they take you, but because of who you discover yourself to be along the way. 2 years after that October night in the Rockies, Marcus Chun stood at the edge of another precipice, but this time he wasn't alone. Behind him, 3 other members of the Boulder County Search and Rescue Team prepared their equipment while studying topographical maps spread across the hood of their truck. Ahead, the float irons rose like stone sentinels against the Colorado sky, their red sandstone faces glowing in the late afternoon sun. The call had come 90 minutes earlier. An experienced rock climber named David Kowalski had fallen while free soloing a route called the Naked Edge. His climbing partner had managed to reach him via radio. Reporting that David was conscious but trapped on a narrow ledge roughly 200 feet up the vertical wall, with what appeared to be a broken back. For most people, the scenario would represent an impossible rescue situation. The ledge was too small for helicopter extraction, too high for conventional ladder trucks, and accessed only by technical rock climbing routes that challenged even expert climbers. But for Marcus, impossible had become a relative term. "Chun, you're our best technical climber," said Captain Rebecca Torres, the unit's commanding officer. "Can you establish an anchor point and rappel down to assess the victim?" Marcus studied the rock face through binoculars, identifying potential anchor points and calculating rope requirements. 2 years of intensive training had transformed his body and mind in ways that went far beyond his original rescue of Sarah Williams. Where once he had been a weekend hiker who avoided challenging terrain, he was now rated for high-angle rescue, swift water operations, and winter avalanche response. "I can reach him," Marcus said simply, the same quiet confidence that had carried him through 20 miles of wilderness now applied to vertical stone. As Marcus suited up in his climbing harness and checked his rescue gear, his mind inevitably drifted back to that night with Sarah. The experience had become a touchstone for him, a reminder that human beings were capable of far more than they imagined when circumstances demanded it. But what had started as a single extraordinary event had evolved into something much deeper, a complete reimagining of what his life could be. The climb up the Naked Edge required every skill Marcus had acquired during his transformation from accountant to rescue specialist. The route followed a series of hairline cracks in the red sandstone, demanding precise finger placement and delicate balance moves that would have terrified his former self. But as Marcus ascended toward the stranded climber, he felt the familiar sense of focused calm that came with operating at the edge of human capability. David Kowalski was exactly where his partner had reported, sprawled on a ledge barely 2 feet wide, his face pale with pain and shock. Marcus could see immediately that the man's condition was serious. His leg showed the telltale signs of spinal injury, and he was shivering despite the warm afternoon temperature. "David, my name is Marcus Chun with Boulder County Search and Rescue," Marcus said as he anchored himself to the rock face beside the ledge. "How are you feeling?" "Can't move my legs," David whispered through gritted teeth. "Been here for 3 hours. Starting to think nobody was coming." Marcus began his medical assessment, working with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this routine dozens of times over the past 2 years. Pulse, respiration, pupil response, spinal alignment, all the critical indicators that would determine how to proceed with the rescue. "David, I need to ask you something important," Marcus said as he prepared a cervical collar. "Have you ever heard of a guy who carried an injured hiker 20 miles through the mountains?" David's eyes focused on Marcus with sudden interest. "That was you? The accountant who— Jesus, you're famous." Marcus smiled grimly as he fitted the collar on David's neck. "Not famous. Just stubborn. And right now, I need you to be stubborn. Too, because we're going to get you off this ledge." The rescue operation that followed tested every technique Marcus had learned during his 2 years with the search and rescue team. Working with his colleagues above, he rigged a complex pulley system that would allow them to lift David vertically up the cliff face while maintaining spinal immobilization. The process required precise coordination between team members spread across 200 feet of vertical terrain, with David's life depending on equipment that had to function perfectly under extreme stress. But what struck Marcus most during the 3-hour rescue operation wasn't the technical complexity or physical challenge. It was the familiar sense of purpose that came with risking everything to save a stranger's life. The same feeling that had driven him through the wilderness with Sarah on his back now powered him through the intricate dance of ropes and anchors required to bring David safely to the ground. As the ambulance carried David away to Boulder Community Hospital, Captain Torres approached Marcus with an expression he had seen before, the mixture of respect and bewilderment that people showed when witnessing something that challenged their understanding of human limitations. "Chun, I've been doing this for 15 years, she said, "and I've never seen anyone adapt to high-angle rescue the way you have. Most people take years to develop that level of confidence and skill. You did it in 18 months. Marcus packed his climbing gear methodically, considering her words. The truth was that his rapid development as a rescue specialist had surprised him as much as anyone else. But he had come to understand that his experience with Sarah had been more than just a single, extraordinary event. It had been a revelation of capabilities that had always existed within him, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. "I had a good teacher," Marcus said, thinking not of his instructors at the rescue academy, but of that October night when necessity had been his only guide. 3 weeks later, Marcus received a phone call that would test his transformation in an entirely different way. Sarah Williams was getting married. "I know this might sound strange," Sarah said during their conversation, "but I was hoping you could walk me down the aisle. My father passed away 2 years ago, and, well, you're the person who gave me the chance to have this wedding at all." The request caught Marcus completely off guard. In the 2 years since their rescue, he and Sarah had maintained occasional contact phone calls on the anniversary of their wilderness ordeal, updates on her recovery and his career change, the comfortable friendship of two people who had shared an experience that defied explanation. But the idea of participating in her wedding felt surreal. "Sarah, I'm honored that you'd ask," Marcus said carefully, But don't you think that might be complicated? I mean, we barely knew each other before that night. That's exactly why. It makes sense, Sarah replied. You didn't save me because we were friends or family. You saved me because it was the right thing to do. That's the kind of person I want walking me down the aisle, someone who represents the best of what human beings can be. The wedding took place on a September afternoon in a small church in Sarah's hometown of Columbus, Ohio. Marcus flew in the day before, nervous about meeting Sarah's family and friends, uncertain about his role in an event that felt both deeply personal and strangely public, but his concerns evaporated the moment he saw Sarah in her wedding dress. The woman who had been broken and dying on his back 2 years earlier stood before him radiant with health and happiness. Her recovery had been remarkable. She walked with only a slight limp, and the haunted expression he remembered from their wilderness ordeal had been replaced by genuine joy. You clean up pretty good for an accountant turned mountain rescue guy, Sarah said with a grin as Marcus offered her his arm. You clean up pretty good for someone who used to be a human backpack, Marcus replied, and they both laughed at the absurdity of their shared history. Walking Sarah down the aisle, Marcus found himself thinking about the chain of events that had brought them to this moment. A random scream in the darkness, a decision to stop rather than drive past, 20 miles of impossible terrain that had somehow become possible, all leading to this celebration of life and love and the simple miracle of survival. During the reception, Sarah's new husband, Thomas Richardson, approached Marcus with obvious emotion. I need to thank you, Thomas said, gripping Marcus's hand firmly. Not just for saving Sarah's life, but for making this day possible, for giving us the chance to have a future together. The words hit Marcus harder than he had expected. Throughout his transformation from accountant to rescue specialist, he had focused on the technical aspects of his new career, the skills to master, the certifications to earn, the equipment to learn. But Thomas's gratitude reminded him of the deeper purpose behind his work, the creation of futures that would otherwise be lost. Later that evening, as the wedding celebration wound down, Marcus found himself in conversation with Dr. Patricia Webb, a psychiatrist who specialized in post-traumatic growth, the phenomenon of people becoming stronger and more capable after surviving extreme challenges. Your story is a textbook example of what we call post-traumatic growth, Dr. Webb explained as they sat at a table overlooking the dance floor where Sarah and Thomas swayed to slow music. Most people who survive extreme situations return to their previous lives with minimal lasting change. But a small percentage use the experience as a catalyst for fundamental transformation. What makes the difference? Marcus asked, genuinely curious about the psychology behind his own transformation. Usually, it's the recognition that if you can survive the impossible once, you can probably do it again, Dr. Webb said. The experience shatters your previous understanding of your own limitations and creates a new baseline for what you believe is possible. Marcus watched Sarah dancing with her new husband, both of them surrounded by family and friends whose lives had been enriched by their survival and recovery. The ripple effects of that October night continued to expand outward, touching people who had never heard of the Continental Divide Trail or Forest Service Road 125. A year later, Marcus was selected to lead Boulder County's first specialized high-altitude rescue unit, a team designed to respond to emergencies in the state's most challenging mountain terrain. The appointment came with a promotion to lieutenant and responsibility for training other rescue specialists in techniques that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible. On the unit's first official mission, Marcus found himself back in the same wilderness area where he had carried Sarah to safety 3 years earlier. This time, the call involved 2 teenage hikers who had become lost during a sudden October snowstorm, an almost perfect echo of the circumstances that had changed his life. As Marcus led his team through the snow-covered wilderness, following GPS coordinates toward the missing hikers, he reflected on how completely his existence had been transformed. The careful, risk-averse accountant who had driven these mountain roads 3 years ago no longer existed. In his place was someone who actively sought out situations that most people would consider impossible or insane. But the transformation hadn't been limited to his professional life. Marcus had discovered that pushing beyond perceived limitations in one area inevitably affected every other aspect of his existence. He was more confident in relationships, more willing to take creative risks, more comfortable with uncertainty and challenge. When they found the lost hikers, cold and frightened but uninjured, huddled beneath a makeshift shelter, Marcus saw his own journey reflected in their faces. They had entered the wilderness as inexperienced teenagers on a casual day hike. They would leave as survivors who had learned something fundamental about their own resilience and capability. "How did you find us?" one of the hikers asked as Marcus's team provided warm clothing and hot soup. "We followed the same trails you did," Marcus replied. "Sometimes the path forward becomes clear when you stop thinking about what's impossible and start focusing on what's necessary." As his team led the rescued hikers back toward safety, Marcus realized that his transformation would never truly be complete. Each rescue mission, each impossible situation overcome, added new layers to his understanding of human potential. The accountant who had stopped for a stranger's scream in the darkness had become someone entirely different, not through gradual change over years, but through the revolutionary recognition that extraordinary circumstances could reveal extraordinary capabilities. The mountains that had once seemed like distant landscape features now felt like familiar territory, where he had learned the most important lesson of his life, that the difference between impossible and inevitable often came down to a simple refusal to quit. 5 years after the night that changed everything, Marcus Chun received a call that would force him to confront the one question he had never been able to answer. What happens when the person who saves lives needs saving themselves? The call came at 2:30 a.m. on a Tuesday in March, jolting Marcus from the deep sleep that had become increasingly elusive as his responsibilities with Boulder County Search and Rescue had expanded. The voice on the other end belonged to Captain Torres, but her usual composure was replaced by something Marcus had never heard before: raw panic. "Marcus, we have a situation," Torres said without preamble. "There's been an avalanche in the backcountry near Loveland Pass. Multiple burials. But that's not why I'm calling you." Marcus was already reaching for his gear bag, the automatic response of someone who had answered hundreds of emergency calls over the past 5 years. "What do you need?" "One of the buried victims. Marcus, it's Elena Vasquez." The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. Elena Vasquez was more than just a fellow rescue specialist. She was the person who had trained him in advanced mountaineering techniques, who had pushed him to develop capabilities he didn't know he possessed, and who had become his closest friend and confidant during his transformation from accountant to elite rescue operative. Elena was also the woman he had been planning to propose to. "How long has she been under?" Marcus asked, his training overriding the emotional chaos threatening to overwhelm him. "Unknown. The avalanche occurred sometime after midnight. Her GPS beacon activated at 12:47 a.m., but we didn't receive the signal until 20 minutes ago due to atmospheric interference." "Marcus, you know the statistics on avalanche survival." Marcus knew them all too well. After 15 minutes buried in snow, survival rates dropped precipitously. After 30 minutes, the chances of finding someone alive were less than 50%. After an hour, rescue often became recovery. Elena had potentially been buried for over 2 hours. "I'm en route," Marcus said, already heading toward his truck. "Have you activated the full response team?" "Everyone's mobilized but Marcus. The avalanche zone is in technical terrain. Class 5 climbing required just to reach the burial area. Most of our team doesn't have the skills for that kind of approach." Marcus understood immediately. Of the 18 active members of Boulder County Search and Rescue, only 4 were certified for the level of technical climbing required to access the remote avalanche zone where Elena's beacon was transmitting. And of those 4, Marcus was the only one with extensive experience in avalanche rescue techniques. The drive to Loveland Pass took 90 minutes through mountain roads, still slick with March snow. During the journey, Marcus fought to maintain the emotional detachment that had become his trademark during rescue operations. But this wasn't just another mission. This was Elena, the woman who had taught him that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. The staging area was chaos, controlled by years of emergency response experience. Trucks from multiple agencies lined the roadside, their emergency lights painting the pre-dawn darkness in alternating reds and blues. The incident commander, Chief Martinez from Summit County Search and Rescue, briefed Marcus on the situation, while technicians prepared specialized avalanche rescue equipment. "We have 3 confirmed burials based on beacon signals," Martinez explained, pointing to a topographical map spread across the hood of his command vehicle. 2 victims have been located and extricated, both alive, both hospitalized with hypothermia and minor injuries. But the 3rd beacon. He indicated a point high on the mountainside, accessible only by a route that would challenge even expert climbers. "That's Elena," Marcus said, studying the terrain through binoculars. The avalanche had swept down a steep couloir, carrying thousands of tons of snow and debris into a narrow valley surrounded by near-vertical rock walls. Reaching Elena's position would require ascending 800 feet of technical rock and ice climbing, then conducting a precision search in unstable snow conditions. "Marcus, I have to ask," Chief Martinez said quietly, "given your personal relationship with the victim, are you sure you can maintain operational objectivity?" It was a fair question, one that Marcus had been asking himself during the drive from Boulder. In rescue operations, emotional attachment could be fatal. It led to poor decision-making, unnecessary risks, and the potential for multiple casualties instead of successful rescues. But as Marcus looked up at the mountain where Elena was buried, he felt the same quiet certainty that had driven him to carry Sarah Williams 20 miles through the wilderness. Some situations transcended normal protocols and demanded responses that operated beyond the boundaries of conventional wisdom. "Chief, 5 years ago I discovered I could do impossible things when someone's life depended on it," Marcus said. "Today isn't going to be any different." The ascent to the avalanche zone pushed Marcus to the absolute limits of his climbing ability. The route followed a series of ice-covered ledges and crack systems that required precise technique and unwavering focus. Each handhold had to be tested, each footstep calculated to avoid triggering additional slides in the unstable snow conditions. Marcus climbed alone, despite protocols that normally required pairs for technical rescues. The urgency of Elena's situation and the limited number of climbers qualified for the route made solo operation the only viable option. As he ascended, Marcus maintained radio contact with the command team below, reporting his progress and receiving updates on Elena's beacon signal. "Signal is still active and consistent," came Torres's voice through his radio earpiece. "But Marcus, it's been over 3 hours since the initial burial. You need to prepare for the possibility that—" Marcus cut off the transmission. He understood the implications, understood the statistical reality of avalanche survival, but he refused to accept that Elena might already be gone. The same stubborn determination that had carried him through 20 miles of wilderness was now driving him up 800 feet of vertical terrain toward a woman whose life hung in the balance. The avalanche debris field, when Marcus finally reached it, was a landscape of chaos. Snow and ice were mixed with uprooted trees, scattered rocks, and the twisted remains of what had once been a pristine alpine environment. Elena's beacon signal was coming from somewhere beneath tons of consolidated snow that had hardened to near concrete consistency. Marcus began the systematic process of avalanche rescue, probing the snow with a collapsible probe, following the strongest beacon signal toward what he hoped would be Elena's location. The work was physically exhausting and mentally agonizing, each probe thrust representing another second of Elena's diminishing survival window. 20 minutes into the search, Marcus's probe hit something solid at a depth of 4 feet. Not the yielding resistance of packed snow, but the unmistakable firmness of a human body. "I've got contact," Marcus radioed to the command team. Beginning excavation. Digging through 4 feet of avalanche debris by hand was like excavating concrete with a spoon. The snow had been compressed and frozen into a solid mass that yielded reluctantly to Marcus's frantic digging. His hands became numb, then bleeding, then numb again as he clawed through the frozen barrier separating him from Elena. When Marcus finally uncovered Elena's face, she appeared to be dead. Her skin was blue-white with hypothermia, her eyes closed, no visible breathing or movement. For a moment that felt like eternity, Marcus stared at the woman he loved, wondering if his desperate climb had been for nothing. Then he noticed something that sent hope surging through his exhausted body. A small air pocket around Elena's face, created by her backpack and helmet, that had prevented complete snow burial. The pocket was tiny, barely larger than a shoebox, but it might have provided enough air to sustain life. Marcus cleared snow from Elena's airway and began emergency warming procedures, using his own body heat and chemical warming packs from his rescue kit. He performed CPR, alternating chest compressions with rescue breathing, while radioing for helicopter evacuation to the nearest trauma center. "Come on, Elena," Marcus whispered between compressions. "You taught me that impossible doesn't mean anything. Now prove it." For 10 minutes that felt like hours, Marcus worked over Elena's motionless form while waiting for the helicopter that would carry her to definitive medical care. The statistical odds were overwhelmingly against survival, nearly 4 hours of burial, severe hypothermia, possible traumatic injuries from the avalanche impact. But statistics hadn't mattered 5 years ago, when everyone told Marcus that carrying Sarah Williams 20 miles was impossible. They didn't matter now as he refused to accept that Elena's story was over. The first sign of life was so subtle that Marcus almost missed it. A slight fluttering of Elena's eyelids, barely visible in the harsh glare of his headlamp. Then a weak cough, followed by the shallow intake of breath that indicated her body was fighting to return to consciousness. "Elena, can you hear me?" Marcus said, his voice breaking with relief and exhaustion. Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused and confused, but unmistakably alive. "Marcus?" She whispered, her voice barely audible. Where am I?" "You're safe," Marcus said, tears freezing on his cheeks in the mountain cold. "You're going to be okay." The helicopter evacuation from the avalanche zone required precision flying that pushed the boundaries of what was possible in mountain conditions. The pilot, a veteran of thousands of mountain rescues, managed to hover just long enough for Marcus to secure Elena in a rescue harness and watch her disappear into the aircraft's cabin as the helicopter disappeared. Toward Denver's trauma centers, Marcus began his own descent from the avalanche zone, a journey that would take him 3 hours, through terrain that had nearly claimed the life of the woman he loved. During the long climb down, he reflected on the strange symmetry of his life. 5 years ago, he had discovered his capacity for the impossible by carrying the stranger to safety. Today, he had confirmed that discovery by refusing to let someone he loved slip away into the statistical finality of avalanche mortality. Elena's recovery took 6 weeks in the hospital and months of physical therapy to regain full function in her frostbitten fingers and toes. But she survived with no permanent disabilities, defying medical predictions about the effects of prolonged hypothermic burial. During her recovery, she and Marcus had countless conversations about risk, rescue, and the strange paths that had brought them together. Elena had initially been drawn to Marcus because of his reputation as the accountant who had accomplished the impossible. She had trained him, challenged him, and fallen in love with the quiet determination that made him attempt things that others considered insane. "You know what the strangest part is?" Elena said during one of their conversations in her hospital room. "Before the avalanche, I thought I understood what you went through with Sarah Williams. I thought I could imagine what it felt like to push beyond every limit to save someone's life." "And now?" Marcus asked. "Now I know that understanding and experiencing are completely different things. What you did for me on that and ... It wasn't just rescue technique or physical capability. It was a fundamental refusal to accept defeat." 6 months after Elena's rescue, Marcus received an unexpected phone call from someone he hadn't heard from in over a year. Sarah Williams, now Sarah Richardson, was calling from Columbus, Ohio, where she had just given birth to her first child. "Marcus, I wanted you to be one of the first to know," Sarah said, her voice filled with the exhausted joy of new motherhood. "We had a daughter yesterday. 8 pounds 2 ounces, perfectly healthy." "Congratulations," Marcus said, genuinely moved by the news. "What's her name?" "Hope," Sarah replied. "We named her Hope because that's what you gave me that night in the mountains. The hope that impossible things can become possible when someone refuses to give up." As Marcus hung up the phone, he realized that his transformation from accountant to rescue specialist had created ripples that extended far beyond his own life or career. Sarah's daughter would grow up in a world that existed only because Marcus had stopped his truck on a dark mountain road 5 years ago. Elena would continue her work saving other lives because Marcus had refused to let statistical probabilities determine her fate. The impossible had indeed become possible, not through supernatural intervention or miraculous circumstances, but through the simple human decision to reject defeat when someone's life hung in the balance. And in learning to accomplish the impossible for others, Marcus had discovered something equally important about himself, that the most meaningful transformations often begin with a stranger's cry in the darkness and a choice to stop rather than drive past. 7 years after that first October night, Marcus Chen found himself standing in front of 300 aspiring rescue specialists at the National Wilderness Rescue Conference in Salt Lake City, preparing to deliver a keynote address he had never wanted to give. The conference organizers had insisted that his story, now legendary within the search and rescue community, needed to be shared with the next generation of emergency responders. But Marcus wasn't there to talk about heroism or inspiration. He was there to discuss something far more complex and dangerous: the psychological cost of repeatedly pushing beyond human limitations, and what happens when the impossible becomes routine. How many of you have heard the story of the accountant who carried a stranger 20 miles through the Colorado wilderness? Marcus asked the assembled crowd. Nearly every hand in the auditorium went up. Marcus nodded grimly. "Then you've heard a myth," he said bluntly. "Not because the facts are wrong, but because myths focus on outcomes while ignoring consequences. Today, I want to talk about what that story doesn't include: the price of transformation, and why some rescues succeed while others end in tragedy." The audience stirred uncomfortably. They had come expecting an inspirational tale of triumph over adversity, not a lecture on the darker aspects of emergency response. But Marcus had learned through 7 years of increasingly complex rescues that the whole truth was more important than comfortable myths. 6 months ago, I failed, Marcus continued, his voice carrying the weight of recent trauma. For the first time since I became a rescue specialist, I encountered a situation where refusing to accept defeat wasn't enough, where determination and skill and stubborn persistence led not to miraculous salvation, but to preventable death. Marcus clicked to the first slide of his presentation, a photograph of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in southern Colorado, their peaks shrouded in the violent weather that had created the rescue situation he was about to describe. The call had come in during a late season blizzard that had caught several climbing parties, unprepared for the sudden shift from mild autumn weather to full winter conditions. Multiple teams were trapped on various peaks throughout the range, but one situation had immediately commanded Marcus's attention: a father and his 12-year-old son stranded on the summit of Crestone Peak with inadequate gear and no viable descent route in the whiteout conditions. The father's name was Robert Nash, Marcus told the conference audience. He was a software engineer from Denver who had been taking his son Jake on increasingly challenging climbs as a way to bond and build confidence. They had summited Crestone Peak just as the storm hit, leaving them trapped at 14,300 feet with visibility near zero and temperatures dropping toward 20 below. Marcus had been part of a 4-person team attempting to reach the stranded climbers, but the conditions were unlike anything he had experienced during his 7 years of rescue work. Winds exceeding 60 miles per hour made helicopter extraction impossible. Ground-based rescue required ascending 4,000 feet of technical terrain in near whiteout conditions that turned every step into a navigation challenge. We made it to within 800 feet of their position, Marcus continued, advancing to a slide showing GPS tracking data from the rescue attempt. But by then, we had been climbing for 14 hours in conditions that should have forced us to abort the mission hours earlier. 3 members of our team were showing signs of severe exhaustion and early hypothermia. Captain Torres had made the call that Marcus had dreaded: abort the rescue and wait for improved conditions. It was the right decision from a risk management perspective. Continuing the ascent would likely have resulted in additional casualties without guaranteeing the successful rescue of the father and son, but Marcus had found himself unable to accept the order to retreat. This is where my story becomes a cautionary tale rather than inspiration, Marcus told the conference audience. For 7 years, I had succeeded in impossible rescues by refusing to acknowledge limitations. That approach had saved lives and built a reputation. But success had also created a dangerous illusion that determination alone could overcome any obstacle. Against direct orders, Marcus had continued climbing toward the stranded father and son while his team descended to safety. His radio communication with the command post showed a man operating beyond rational decision-making, driven by the same stubborn refusal to quit that had made him famous within the rescue community. I reached Robert and Jake Nash at 3:17 a.m., Marcus said, his voice heavy with the memory. They had been exposed to extreme conditions for over 18 hours. Jake was unconscious with severe hypothermia. Robert was barely coherent, but still trying to keep his son warm. The rescue attempt that followed represented everything Marcus had learned about operating in impossible conditions. Working alone, in hurricane-force winds and sub-zero temperatures, he had managed to stabilize Jake Nash and prepare both father and son for evacuation. His plan was to lower them down the mountain's east face using a complex rope system that would bypass the most dangerous sections of the descent route. The technical aspects of the rescue were flawless, Marcus continued, clicking to a diagram showing the rope rigging he had constructed. I had solved the mechanical problems, overcome the environmental challenges, and demonstrated once again that impossible situations could be conquered through skill and determination. But what Marcus hadn't accounted for was the psychological state of Robert Nash, a man who had spent 18 hours watching his 12-year-old son slowly dying from exposure while feeling completely helpless to prevent it. As I prepared to lower Jake down the first pitch, Robert Nash began to panic, Marcus said quietly. He had been holding himself together through sheer force of will, but the sight of his unconscious son being lowered into the darkness broke something inside him. He grabbed my gear, trying to follow his son down the rope system before I could properly secure him. What happened next had played out in Marcus's nightmares for the past 6 months. Robert Nash, in his desperation to stay with his son, had overwhelmed the careful rope system that Marcus had constructed. His uncontrolled movements had created a pendulum effect that slammed him into the rock wall with fatal force. Robert Nash died instantly from the impact, Marcus told the silent auditorium. His son Jake survived. We were able to complete the evacuation and Jake made a full recovery. But Robert's death was entirely preventable. It happened because I had operated outside established protocols, because I had confused past success with future invincibility. The investigation that followed Robert Nash's death had nearly ended Marcus's rescue career. The official report cited multiple protocol violations and poor risk assessment that had contributed to the fatal outcome. Marcus had been suspended from active duty for 6 months while undergoing psychological evaluation and additional training. The hardest part wasn't the official consequences, Marcus continued. It was the realization that my approach to rescue work, the same stubborn determination that had saved Sarah Williams and Elena Vasquez, had created a blind spot that cost a man his life. Dr. Amanda Foster, the psychologist who had evaluated Marcus during his suspension, had identified a phenomenon common among elite rescue specialists: invincibility syndrome. Success in extreme situations could create a dangerous feedback loop, where operators began to believe they were immune to the limitations that applied to everyone else. Dr. Foster helped me understand that transformation isn't a destination. It's an ongoing process that requires constant self-evaluation and course correction, Marcus told the conference audience. The man who carried Sarah Williams 20 miles wasn't a finished product. He was the beginning of a journey that would include both remarkable successes and devastating failures. Marcus clicked a photograph of Jake Nash, now 13 years old, taken at a recent climbing event where he had spoken about wilderness safety in honor of his father's memory. Jake Nash continues to climb, Marcus said. But he does it with proper gear, appropriate training, and respect for the mountains that took his father's life. He understands something that took me 7 years to learn, that courage isn't the absence of limitations. It's the wisdom to recognize them and work within them. The rehabilitation process that followed Marcus's suspension had been more challenging than any rescue operation he had ever attempted. Working with Dr. Foster, he had been forced to deconstruct his entire approach to emergency response and rebuild it with a more nuanced understanding of risk and responsibility. I learned that there's a difference between impossible and inevitable. Marcus continued. Sarah Williams's rescue was inevitable because the alternative, leaving her to die, was unacceptable to me personally. But Robert Nash's death was inevitable too, given the choices I made and the protocols I violated. The new Marcus Chen, who returned to active duty after his suspension, was fundamentally different from the legendary figure who had built his reputation on refusing to accept defeat. He still possessed the same technical skills and physical capabilities, but he now operated within a framework that acknowledged the existence of situations where retreat was not just acceptable, but necessary. 3 weeks ago, I was part of a rescue operation involving 2 lost hikers in the same wilderness area where I first carried Sarah Williams, Marcus told the audience. Weather conditions deteriorated rapidly, creating risks that would have been manageable for a solo operator, but dangerous for a full-team extraction. The old Marcus Chen would have pressed forward regardless of conditions, driven by the belief that determination could overcome any obstacle. But the new Marcus had called for evacuation of the rescue team when weather created unacceptable risks, even though it meant the lost hikers would spend an additional night in the wilderness. Both hikers survived the extra night of exposure and were successfully rescued the following morning when conditions improved, Marcus said. The delay was uncomfortable, but not life-threatening. More importantly, all 6 members of the rescue team returned home safely to their families. Marcus clicked to his final slide, a photograph of Elena Vasquez, now his wife of 2 years, leading a training session for new rescue specialists at their joint wilderness education company. Elena and I now run a training program that focuses on what we call sustainable heroism, Marcus explained. We teach rescue specialists how to operate at the edge of human capability while maintaining the judgment necessary for long-term effectiveness. It's not as dramatic as the myths people tell about impossible rescues, but it saves more lives in the long run. The question and answer session that followed Marcus's presentation was intense and sometimes uncomfortable. Young rescue specialists struggled with the implications of his message that the very qualities that made someone capable of extraordinary rescues could also lead to devastating failures. "Are you saying we should accept defeat when lives are at stake?" asked a firefighter from Phoenix. "I'm saying we should recognize the difference between tactical retreat and strategic defeat," Marcus replied. "Robert Nash died because I confused my personal need to never quit with his son's need for a rescue plan that prioritized safety over speed." "But what about Sarah Williams?" pressed a paramedic from Seattle. "If you had followed protocols that night, wouldn't she have died?" Marcus considered the question carefully, one that had haunted him throughout his suspension and rehabilitation. "Maybe," he said finally, "but maybe not. Maybe a conventional rescue team could have reached her faster than I could carry her 20 miles. Maybe helicopter evacuation would have been possible if I had waited for daylight. The point is, I'll never know. Because I chose to act on emotion rather than analysis." As the conference concluded and participants filed out of the auditorium, Marcus found himself approached by a young woman who introduced herself as Lieutenant Maria Santos from California Search and Rescue. "Mr. Chun, I wanted to thank you for your honesty today," she said. "I've been struggling with some of the same issues you described, feeling like I have to attempt every rescue regardless of conditions. Like backing down makes me a failure." Marcus looked at this young rescue specialist and saw something of his former self, the absolute commitment to saving lives that could become a dangerous obsession if not properly channeled. "The hardest lesson I learned," Marcus told her, "is that sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is walk away. Not because you're giving up, but because you're preserving your ability to help people tomorrow." As Marcus left the conference and flew back to Colorado, he reflected on how completely his understanding of heroism had evolved. The accountant who had stopped for a stranger's scream 7 years ago had believed that determination alone could overcome any obstacle. The rescue specialist who had saved Elena from an avalanche had operated on the assumption that past success guaranteed future victory. But the man who had failed to save Robert Nash understood something more complex, that true heroism lay not in attempting the impossible, but in developing the wisdom to recognize when the impossible was worth attempting, and when it was simply impossible. The transformation that had begun with Sarah Williams would continue for the rest of his life, shaped by both spectacular successes and devastating failures, guided by the understanding that saving lives required not just courage and skill, but the humility to acknowledge that even heroes had limitations. 10 years after that fateful October night, Marcus Chun stood at the edge of a precipice that had nothing to do with mountains or rescue operations. At 44 years old, he faced a decision that would determine not just his own future, but the legacy of everything he had built since transforming from accountant to legendary rescue specialist. The letter in his hands bore the official seal of the Department of Homeland Security. Inside was an offer that represented the pinnacle of emergency response careers, director of the newly formed National Crisis Response Division, a position that would place him in charge of coordinating disaster response operations across the entire United States. "It's everything you've worked toward," Elena said as they sat on the deck of their cabin overlooking the same mountains where Marcus had first discovered his capacity for the impossible. 10 years ago, you were calculating tax returns. Now they want you to run the country's emergency response system. Marcus studied the letter again, reading between the lines of bureaucratic language to understand what accepting this position would really mean. He would move from hands-on rescue work to administrative oversight, from saving individual lives to managing systems that could save thousands. It was a logical progression, the natural culmination of a career that had redefined what one person could accomplish. But it was also an ending, the final step away from the mountains and wilderness areas where he had learned who he really was. The decision was complicated by something that had happened just 3 weeks earlier. An incident that reminded Marcus why direct rescue work remained the core of his identity, despite all the administrative responsibilities and training programs he now managed. Hurricane Isabella had struck the Gulf Coast with unprecedented fury, spawning tornadoes and storm surges that overwhelmed local emergency response capabilities. Marcus had been deployed with a federal disaster response team to coordinate water rescues in the flooded parishes around New Orleans. Most of the operations had been routine by Marcus's standards: helicopter evacuations from rooftops, boat rescues from flooded neighborhoods, the methodical process of moving people from danger to safety using established protocols and coordinated teams. But on the third day of operations, Marcus encountered a situation that stripped away all the protocols and systems, leaving him face to face with the same fundamental choice he had confronted with Sarah Williams a decade earlier. The call had come from a Coast Guard helicopter pilot who had spotted something unusual while conducting aerial reconnaissance over a particularly devastated area. In the middle of a flooded subdivision, a house had been split in half by a massive oak tree that had fallen during the storm. Trapped in the upper portion of the destroyed structure was an elderly woman who appeared to be injured and unable to evacuate on her own. What made the situation impossible by conventional standards was the instability of the structure. The house was balanced precariously on the fallen tree, and any additional weight or vibration could cause the entire remaining structure to collapse into the floodwaters below. Helicopter rescue was impossible due to the lack of stable anchor points and the risk of rotor wash bringing down the structure. Boat access was blocked by debris and shallow water that prevented close approach. Every protocol, every standard operating procedure, every lesson learned from decades of disaster response said the same thing: establish a perimeter, wait for specialized equipment, and attempt rescue only when conditions could be made safe for emergency personnel. But the woman, whose name Marcus later learned was Dorothy Washington, was 93 years old, diabetic, and had been without medication for 3 days. She wouldn't survive another 12 hours of waiting for ideal rescue conditions. Marcus had found himself studying the destroyed house through binoculars, calculating angles and load-bearing capacities with the same methodical approach he had once applied to tax calculations. The structural engineering was complex, but not impossible to navigate. A single person, moving carefully and distributing weight properly, could potentially reach Dorothy Washington and evacuate her before the structure collapsed. "Chun, you're not seriously considering this," his team leader, Commander Sarah Mitchell, had said when Marcus outlined his assessment. "That house could come down at any moment. We don't risk personnel for low-probability rescues." But as Marcus watched Dorothy Washington through the binoculars, saw her waving weakly from the window of her destroyed home, he realized that 10 years of transformation hadn't changed the fundamental equation that had driven him to carry Sarah Williams through the wilderness. Some situations transcended probability calculations and risk assessments, demanding responses that operated outside the boundaries of conventional logic. "Commander, with respect, this isn't a low-probability rescue," Marcus had replied. "It's a certainty. She dies if we don't act, and she lives if we do. The only variable is whether we're willing to accept the risk." The approach to Dorothy Washington's house required every skill Marcus had developed during his decade of rescue work. He moved through the floodwaters on a small inflatable raft, navigating debris fields and unstable wreckage that could puncture his vessel or trap him beneath the surface. When he reached the house, he had to climb through the tangled branches of the fallen oak tree, distributing his weight carefully to avoid triggering the structural collapse that everyone expected. Dorothy Washington was exactly where the helicopter pilot had reported, trapped in what remained of her bedroom, injured but conscious, surrounded by the accumulated possessions of 93 years of life, now scattered and destroyed by the storm. "Who are you?" she asked as Marcus carefully climbed through her broken window. "My name is Marcus Chen," he replied, beginning his medical assessment while studying the structural situation around them. "I'm here to get you out of this house." "Honey, this house is coming down," Dorothy said with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had survived 9 decades of various disasters. "You shouldn't be here. You're going to get yourself killed." It was almost exactly what Sarah Williams had said 10 years earlier, the same desperate plea for Marcus to save himself rather than risk his life for a stranger. But Marcus had learned something important during his decade of rescue work. The people most worth saving were often those who insisted they weren't worth the risk. "Mrs. Washington, I've been in situations like this before," Marcus said as he prepared her for evacuation. "The house might come down, but not today, and not while we're in it." The evacuation required 47 minutes of careful movement through a structure that groaned and shifted with every step. Marcus had to improvise a stretcher system using debris from the house itself, then navigate back through the oak tree while supporting Dorothy's weight and maintaining the precise balance that kept them both from falling into the floodwaters below. Halfway through the evacuation, the house did exactly what everyone had predicted. It collapsed. But Marcus had anticipated the failure point and positioned himself and Dorothy in the one section of the structure that would remain stable when the rest fell. They rode the controlled collapse like experienced sailors riding out a storm, then completed their evacuation as the remains of Dorothy Washington's home settled into the Louisiana floodwaters. The rescue made national news. Not because it was particularly dramatic by disaster response standards, but because it represented something that had become increasingly rare in modern emergency management: a willingness to accept personal risk for individual lives rather than managing disasters through statistical optimization and resource allocation. "Marcus Chen does it again," read the headline in the Washington Post. "The accountant-turned-hero saves 93-year-old from hurricane wreckage." But for Marcus, the rescue of Dorothy Washington represented something more complex than another addition to his legend. It was confirmation that 10 years of transformation hadn't dulled his ability to operate beyond conventional limitations when someone's life hung in the balance. Despite all the training in sustainable heroism and risk management, despite the hard lessons learned from Robert Nash's death, Marcus remained fundamentally the same person who had refused to drive past a stranger's scream in the darkness. Which brought him back to the letter from the Department of Homeland Security and the decision that would determine the next phase of his life. "What does your gut tell you?" Elena asked, watching her husband struggle with a choice that would have been impossible to imagine when he was calculating tax returns in his Denver office. Marcus looked out at the mountains where he had discovered his true calling, where he had learned to push beyond every limitation he had previously accepted. About human capability. The peaks rose like old friends, familiar and challenging, offering the kind of direct, uncompromising problems that could be solved through skill and determination rather than bureaucratic navigation and political compromise. "My gut tells me that the country needs someone to run disaster response operations who understands what's really possible when everything seems impossible," Marcus said slowly. "But it also tells me that the moment I take that job, I stop being the person who actually does impossible things and become someone who manages other people doing them." Elena nodded, understanding the dilemma that went to the heart of Marcus's identity. For 10 years, he had been defined by his willingness to personally accept risks that others considered unacceptable. Taking the Homeland Security position would move him into a role where his primary responsibility was preventing others from taking those same risks. "There's a third option," Elena said quietly. Marcus looked at her, waiting. "We expand the training program," Elena continued. Instead of you managing a federal bureaucracy, we create an organization that teaches other people to think the way you think. We build a generation of rescue specialists who understand how to operate beyond conventional limitations while maintaining operational wisdom. The idea had been percolating for months as Marcus and Elena discussed the future of their wilderness education company. What if they could scale their approach, creating training programs that produced not just technically competent rescue specialists, but people who understood how to access extraordinary capabilities when ordinary methods weren't sufficient? The Chun method, Elena said with a slight smile. A systematic approach to developing the psychology and skills necessary for impossible rescues. Marcus considered the proposal, thinking about all the people he had trained over the past decade. All the rescue specialists who had approached him asking how to develop the mindset that made extraordinary rescues possible. The traditional training programs focused on technical skills and established protocols, but they didn't address the psychological transformation necessary to operate effectively in situations where protocols failed. We could base it here, Marcus sighed, looking out at the wilderness that had been his teacher for 10 years. Students would learn technical skills in the same environment, where they developed the mental framework for pushing beyond limitations. The vision that emerged over the following hours was ambitious and unprecedented. A comprehensive training program that would attract rescue specialists from around the world, teaching them not just how to perform difficult rescues, but how to recognize when impossible situations demanded impossible responses. Marcus declined the Homeland Security position in a letter that he hand-delivered to Washington, D.C. the following week. In it, he explained that he could serve the country more effectively by creating the next generation of rescue specialists than by managing the current system from behind a desk. The Chen Institute for Advanced Rescue Operations opened 18 months later on 500 acres of Colorado wilderness, featuring training facilities that recreated every type of rescue environment imaginable. Students came from fire departments, search and rescue teams, military special operations units, and emergency medical services from around the world. But the core curriculum wasn't about technical skills or equipment, it was about developing what Marcus had come to call possibility thinking, the mental framework that allowed people to find solutions when conventional approaches failed. The most important lesson, Marcus told each new class of students, isn't how to carry someone 20 miles through the wilderness. It's how to recognize the moment when carrying someone 20 miles becomes not just possible, but necessary. The program's success exceeded every expectation. Within 3 years, Chen Institute graduates were involved in major rescue operations on every continent, bringing a new approach to emergency response that combined rigorous technical training with the psychological flexibility necessary for truly extraordinary rescues. More importantly, the Institute became a place where people could undergo the same fundamental transformation that Marcus had experienced, discovering capabilities they never knew they possessed through direct confrontation with seemingly impossible challenges. Sarah Williams, now Sarah Richardson, brought her 7-year-old daughter Hope to visit the Institute on the 10th anniversary of her rescue. Hope was a confident, adventurous child who had grown up hearing the story of how a stranger had carried her mother to safety, creating the future that allowed Hope to exist. "Uncle Marcus," Hope said as they toured the training facilities, "Mom says you used to be an accountant who was afraid of mountains." Marcus laughed, remembering the man he had been before that October night changed everything. "That's right. I thought mountains were dangerous places where bad things happened to unprepared people. And now?" Hope asked with the directness that only children possessed. Marcus looked out at the peaks surrounding the Institute, mountains that had become his partners in transformation, his co-teachers in the ongoing education of rescue specialists who would carry on his legacy long after he was gone. "Now I know that mountains are places where ordinary people discover they're capable of extraordinary things," he said. but only if they're willing to stop calculating the odds and start focusing on what needs to be done. Elena joined them as they completed the tour, her own transformation from technical climbing instructor to co-director of an internationally recognized training institute, reflecting the same kind of personal evolution that had defined Marcus's journey. "What's next?" Sarah asked as they stood together, overlooking the training grounds, where the next generation of rescue specialists was learning to push beyond conventional limitations. Marcus considered the question, thinking about all the impossible rescues yet to be attempted, all the people who would face choices between safety and service, all the moments when someone would have to decide whether to drive past or stop when they heard a stranger's cry for help. "Next, we teach more people that impossible is just another word for hasn't been done yet," Marcus said. "We create a world where there are always people willing to carry others 20 miles when 20 miles is what it takes." As the sun set behind the peaks that had been the stage for his transformation, Marcus Chun reflected on the journey that had brought him from a careful, predictable life to this moment of watching others discover their own extraordinary capabilities. The accountant who had stopped for Sarah Williams no longer existed, replaced by someone who understood that the most important calculations couldn't be done with numbers. They required the mathematics of human compassion and the algebra of refusing to accept defeat. The impossible had become inevitable, not through magic or miraculous intervention, but through the simple recognition that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they stopped worrying about the odds and started focusing on what needed to be done. And in a world full of people who needed saving, there would always be work for those who understood that sometimes the distance between impossible and inevitable was exactly 20 miles, measured not in feet or meters, but in the willingness to carry someone else's weight until both of you reached safety together. The transformation that had begun with a stranger's scream in the darkness would continue forever, carried forward by each new person who learned that their limitations were far more flexible than they had ever imagined, and that the most meaningful journeys often began with the simple decision to stop and help when someone cried out in the darkness. 10 years after changing everything, Marcus Chun had learned the most important lesson of all, that transformation wasn't a destination, but a way of traveling through a world full of people who needed someone willing to carry them 20 miles when 20 miles was what it took to save their lives. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.